Hello class, today we're going to cover chapter 11, which looks at juvenile aftercare. So our learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end, you should be able to describe the goals of aftercare, decide who is responsible for releasing youth from training schools, describe the assessment of those on aftercare, describe risk control programs like intensive aftercare supervision, describe the downsides of the current reentry process, describe the role of the aftercare officer, and describe the means by which aftercare can be improved. So first we need to start off by talking about what actually aftercare is. And it's essentially, you can equate it to parole in adult court. So these are reiterative services or just repetitious services that are going to prepare the youth who's been placed out of the home for re-entry into the community by establishing the collaborative relationships with the community to ensure that the delivery of services and supervision is appropriate. Aftercare begins either at or after sentencing and continues through their period of confinement. So when aftercare planning should start is as soon as they're sentenced or at sentencing specifically, because again, the idea is that the juvenile is going to come back into the community. So you need to start that reentry planning immediately. So what are the services are they going to need to be successful during that aftercare period? Which is really this continuum of care idea that whatever programs and services the juvenile has while they're incarcerated should be continued while they're in the community. It's really keeping up with that and having those reiterative services that's going to ensure the juvenile is successful. So what are our goals of aftercare? First, it's to release residents at the most favorable time to ensure that we're releasing them when they have had sufficient programming and treatment and at a time when they are ready to come back to their families in the community. The goal is to prepare youth for successful reintegration to come back home, but also to reduce the crimes that are committed by releasing the youth. So we need to ensure that they are ready to reduce violent acts that are committed by those youth who are released, as well as to increase the community confidence that they have in aftercare or that they have in parole, that we can show the community that we can successfully reintegrate a juvenile back into their home and into their community. Also to alleviate the overcrowding of institutions, because there was a period of time where it was very hard to get juveniles into certain facilities. They would have wait lists of up to 8 months. And to monitor youthful offenders. So our goal on aftercare is to make sure that we are monitoring their behaviors and their supervision. And then to discourage them to return to street gangs. Again, not all juveniles are involved in gangs, but one of the goals of aftercare would be to ensure that they don't go back to those same peer groups. So when we release youth from training schools, there's a few different ways that this can happen. It can be either through the executive branch, probation or parole officers, board agencies, or the juvenile judge. And really the determination is just based on the state. So in probation, I will say the probation officer recommends release from the training school, but the judge is the ultimate individual who will say whether or not the juvenile should come home. So arguments that institutional officials should have the decision-making power include that they know the youth better than anyone, but they may end up basing that decision on the subjective behavior of the youth because they've spent so much time with that juvenile. And I've seen it where a facility recommends the juvenile stays and completes more programming. But truthfully, as the probation officer who has been visiting the juvenile frequently, who has kept up with all of the programming that they've been engaged in, I think they're ready to come home. And that's it's a more objective view than someone who's been with that juvenile every day and maybe dealing with some of the nonsense behavior or the small petty things that would just irritate staff or someone in an institutional official who may end up saying, no, I don't think they're ready yet. And then arguments for either an independent agency or a board say that it's because of impartiality. However, some of the arguments say that maybe they're too far removed from the training school to really know what's best, or they may ignore important aspects of the youth or their progress, and that it downgrades professional competence of the professionals who have been involved in that case. So it's hard to say whether or not an independent agency or a board would be a good idea. Again, it would be a very impartial decision maker, but do they really have the knowledge, skills, and the knowledge of that juvenile, specifically the intricacies of their case, to be able to make such a decision? So how do we assess youth on aftercare? Well, we use certain risk needs assessments just like probation does. So what I'll say is a lot of times a juvenile who's placed on probation, so when they come out of an institution, they will go back on probation. And the only way that it's different is that they're getting, typically more structured and a higher level degree of care and services to ensure that successful reintegration. So one of the assessments used is the LSIR, which these are all actuarial tools that are based on the different criminogenic needs, and it predicts parole outcomes. It can also predict how successful an individual will be, institutional misconducts, and it also predicts recidivism. So really this was a collaboration of probation officers, correctional managers, practitioners, and researchers who got together and created the LSIR. There's also the YLS that we use in Pennsylvania for juveniles to assess their risk and needs. And it really just gives you a complete picture of the juvenile to say, what do we need to work on and what is the likelihood that this juvenile would reoffend? So what are some characteristics that we have of youth on aftercare? Typically, they're going to be older minority males who are charged with nonviolent offenses. 50% of them live in single-parent households, and 25% have a father that's incarcerated. 10% of them are actually parents themselves. And the education level is that of about 7th grade. And there's a fair amount who have sort of learning disabilities that they would have IEPs for learning extra assistance. 2/3 do have a mental health disorder, and a lot of them spent the majority of their adolescence in some type of custody, whether that was being arrested, being placed in detention, being placed in other facilities. And a lot of them are returning to impoverished families and neighborhoods. So it's really this idea of it's not so much just the juvenile and the choices that they're making, but they really are impacted by the environment they're in, their family, and all of these other factors that come together that influence their decision making. So intensive supervision programs, this is where juveniles are again placed on small caseloads and they're going to receive frequent contacts from an aftercare officer. There really is going to be an emphasis on drug and alcohol testing here. And intensive aftercare supervision really targets 3 types of juvenile populations. So they target all parolees, low risk, or high risk. And here we have an intensive aftercare program model, which is really just a combination of social control, so ensuring that there's social control in that juvenile's life, strain and social learning theories that focus on reintegrative processes. So it assumes that serious and chronic delinquency is related to weak social controls that's produced by that social disorganization, having inadequate socialization, and experiencing that strain. And that strain is produced by that social disorganization. So their peer groups really have an influence and can intervene as that social force between the youth with weak bonds or strain and delinquent behaviors. So it's important that we connect juveniles with pro-social others that can really help to pull them out of those behaviors. So what we need here for this IEP program model is really improved communication and coordination between the institutional and aftercare staff. It's really imperative that while a juvenile is in placement, they are having regular and frequent contact with them as well as the program staff, so you can both work together on an effective plan for when they come home. And then having an improved ability for parolees to receive community services immediately after release. So that's why we say aftercare needs to start at or immediately after sentencing, because you want to ensure that whatever programs a juvenile has, they can immediately return to in the community. You don't want to have that lag or lapse. One of the issues that we really see a struggle with is education, because the family has to take all the documents to typically re-enroll the juvenile into the school because they've been out for a significant period of time. And if a parent is not proactive and doesn't get that taken care of, you could have the juvenile sitting at home for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, while they're just waiting to be enrolled back in school. And then all of that work that you did to try and give the juvenile all of these supportive services and education and programming really kind of falls short because they're now sitting at home with nothing to do, but possibly go get in trouble again. Some of the intervention programs that we have, the successful approaches, these are going to target specific dynamic and criminogenic characteristics. So criminogenic needs, we'll say, for example, criminal history is a criminogenic need, but we can't do anything about that. That's a static factor. So we want to address the dynamic ones. So a dynamic risk factor would be their peers, it could be their family, it could be their behavior and personality, things that we can actually change. You need to implement a plan strictly adhered to by trained personnel. So juveniles do thrive on structure as much as they say they hate it. They really do appreciate it and need that to grow and flourish. You also need to require frequent contact between the staff and the juvenile. It's very important that whoever is responsible for delivering those services, the aftercare services, or if it's the probation officer, that they have frequent contact so the juvenile knows exactly what's expected of them. Using cognitive and behavioral treatments, so we know that CBT or cognitive behavioral treatments are really the most effective at changing behavior long term, because we're addressing not only the cognitive, so the way that they think, but we're changing their behavior, so the way that they actually respond in those moments then. And they will target individuals who have the highest risk of recidivism. So what is the downside of our current reentry process? Well, there are a few institutions that actually focus on opportunities and training that are going to prepare them for life back in the community. So a few institutions are going to focus on those job opportunities and employment, the motor vehicle driver training, maybe basic financial management and human relationships, or drug and alcohol counseling. It's very hard for some of these programs to offer everything. There's also a high security risk, a lack of staff, and an inability for youth to handle certain job placements while they're in a facility, which leads facilities to not engage in these practices because it is such a risk and a liability on the program when they're taking juveniles off-site. There's also a lack of community support and supportive systems within the community to effectively address those reintegrative processes that the juvenile needs. And sometimes we just have this fragmented and disorganized system, and you have a lot of key players, a lot of moving parts, and sometimes it's hard to get through services set up. Certain services, I mentioned before that the probation department is responsible for contracting with services and offering those at no cost to the family. However, there are certain programs that will go through the child's insurance, mostly for more mental health or more advanced therapy or counseling sessions. We do help them with all of the paperwork and trying to get through services, but sometimes there can be a fragment or disorganization there if the parent or guardian is not organized and isn't capable of, following through with all the steps that it takes to get that going. You also have to take into account the personal traits of the youth. And sometimes there's arbitrary decision making happening from the aftercare officers. You really have to make sure that you're using your professional discretion within the bounds of your knowledge, experience, and expertise, and not trying to make decisions just because the juvenile really irritated you that day. And then also delinquent peer groups is going to be the detriment of the juvenile, because they can do very, very well in placement, even though they're around other negative peers because it's so structured. But the second they come home, they're so easily influenced by their peers that is the biggest uphill battle, is trying to get youth to say no to their peers. So when we look at those who recidivate versus those who don't, those who recidivate tend to be behind their classmates educationally when they're entering, and then also when they're leaving confinement. So they're really they're educationally behind in grade level. Younger parolees are also more likely to fail, so those who are younger. Those who are career delinquents, those who have been through the system for years, who kind of know the system, because unfortunately they're really not afraid anymore. Juveniles have this fear of going to placement at times, and then once they're there, they realize it's really not as bad as they had thought. And unfortunately, sometimes that means that they don't mind coming back out and committing more crimes, because they know the worst that we can do is put them in a facility. Also, those who they tend to commit crimes against property rather than persons, have, again, frequent confinements, and have difficulty adjusting to pro-social peers, which is why they may continuously just return to those delinquent peer groups because it's what they know and what they're comfortable with. They also tend to maintain friendships with older, more delinquent peers, which again is just going to continuously reinforce those delinquent behaviors. So what really is the responsibility of the aftercare officer? Well, it's really an investigatory and regulatory role. So you're going to provide probation and parole services, but you're combining that with treatment services and also different individualized intervention tools, skill building, and strategies that you as the probation officer are going to use with that juvenile to reinforce those skills. The aftercare officer can return the juvenile to an institutional confinement, though a court hearing does need to occur and the judge does need to agree to that recommendation. And technical violations most frequent and weigh heavily in revocation decisions. So technical violations are the most frequent. These are just the juvenile not following the court order. So they're not committing new offenses. They're really just, they don't know how to follow the rules. They do tend to weigh very heavy in revocation decisions and revoking someone's aftercare and placing them back in a facility. Because what it's really telling us is that the juvenile did not learn to abide by rules while they were in the facility. So they certainly can't follow them when they're home now. And then the revocation decisions are also based sometimes on chance, sometimes on the attitude of the youth, and even the personal attributes of the officer. I mean, I can speak for myself. I very frequently would recommend to place juveniles when I was a PO because I always like to work with them in the community. But there are other officers who at first chance would just recommend that a juvenile be placed because they've been around for a while, and they would give the reasoning of, well, I see where this is going. I've seen this so many times before. If I don't place this juvenile now, I know it's going to happen. They're going to end up committing more crimes. I'm going to have to place them anyway, so I might as well place them now. But again, it's not just up to the PO. You do have a supervisor who has to sign off on the recommendations. There are checks and balances there. And again, you have the prosecution and you also have the defense in court who are going to make their own separate arguments for what should happen during that revocation decision. So some of the options you have are that you can return the juvenile to the training school or to a different training school. You can place them on intensive supervision, so just intensify their supervision level, or maybe put them on home confinement with electronic monitor. So just increasing the graduated response that you have without actually placing them fully back into a placement facility. So we have a few Supreme Court decisions on revocation. So again, we have Memphis v. Ray here, which says that state probationers do have a right to a hearing and counsel when they're accused of a probation violation. You also have Murray v. Page, which says that once paroled, ex-offenders cannot be deprived of freedom without due process. So again, they have to have a hearing. In People, ex-rel versus Warden Green Haven, says that inmates are permitted counsel at revocation hearings. And then Morrissey v. Brewer noted that it requires a hearing before an uninvolved hearing officer who actually decides if that parole violation occurred. So the uninvolved hearing officer can be either a hearing officer or a judge who is someone who's actually going to determine whether or not the violation actually occurred in that case. And then Gagnon v. Scarpelli says that counsel should be provided on a case-by-case basis during revocation hearings. So again, all of these Supreme Court decisions are just reinforcing that during revocation hearings, one, they do have to have a hearing. You can't just revoke. That we need to prove that they actually violated their supervision conditions, and that they do have the right to have counsel at that hearing. Looking at interstate compacts, so this is how we're going to now deal with juveniles who are placed in different states. So typically, placing them in a different state, that means either on probation supervision, or if the juvenile is placed in another facility out of state, sometimes you have to go through an interstate compact because it just has rules that we need to follow to make sure that we're all on the same page between us and the other state. So it's just really an agreement among states to deal with youth when they do move, and we also need to keep them under some sort of supervision. So it's cooperative supervision of delinquent juveniles who are on probation or on parole. It also allows for the return of delinquent juveniles who escape or abscond. So we use our interstate compact, say a juvenile leaves Pennsylvania, goes to another state and doesn't want to come back. We can work with the other state through the interstate compact to help get that juvenile back to our state. Also returns non-delinquent juveniles who run away from home, so your dependent and neglected youth, and just helps protect protection of juveniles and the public. So it helps protect the juvenile by returning them to us, but as well as the public. So when we talk about improvement of our aftercare, aftercare is really a part of a continuum of care that requires parallel services in the facility, and then with careful preparations that they can receive those same services on aftercare. Sometimes we need increased funding and staff to be able really to provide the enhanced service delivery that we're hoping for during this aftercare period. And intensive aftercare requires that we do those formal assessments to really know which offenders need the highest level of intervention and supervision, and so we can offer them the appropriate level of treatment that they need. And to improve aftercare, we really should have reductions in caseload sizes and intensification of contact. So we need to have reduced the caseload sizes so that the probation officers or the parole officer can actually have the extended amount of contact or intense amount of contact that they need to have with that individual to keep them from going back into a facility. So in sum, the goal of aftercare is to provide a continuum of care to juvenile offenders who are being released from an institution. And the releasing authorities can include either the executive branch, probation or parole officers, board agencies, or judges, and it's going to depend on the state. Youth who fail on aftercare due to fragmentation and a lack of coordination between agencies in providing comprehensive plans and services to the youth, as well as community characteristics and even the youth's personal traits. The role of the aftercare officer is going to be to investigate and regulate, as well as supervision and possible revocations if that comes up. And we can improve our aftercare with comprehensive and integrated programming from institutions so that we are providing that continuum of care in order to reduce recidivism long term in these juveniles. This was your Chapter 11 lecture looking at juvenile aftercare and revocation. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I do hope that everyone has a great week.